All right, everybody. Well, I am going to tackle the topic of time. I know we've talked about time before. I like to revisit it though, because it's so easy to lose track of time in your own timeline or to not know where you are because you are trying to remember what happened when things happened. And I know that that is a tricky thing to track in memoir. And it comes up for me from time to time because I do so many memoir assessments and I read lots of things where I get lost in the timeline. And part of what I'm reminding the writer is, all right, well, this needs to be tracked. And where are you? How old are you? So before I even start, I want to give a little bit of permission, which is that you do have some creative license in memoir. If you don't exactly remember when things happened, it is all right to reconstruct your timeline. You're doing your best, of course, to try to reconstruct it as accurately as it happened. But if something happened in 1977 versus 1978, because you don't remember and other things need to flow accordingly, that stuff doesn't matter, right? I mean, if you can reconstruct it, if you can go back to events or journals or news articles or whatever, then yes, try to reconstruct it as accurately as possible. But if you need to fudge the timeline or move your timeline in certain ways accordingly, I want to say that that doesn't qualify as lying or being wrong, and sometimes you do need to move your timeline by matters of months or years in order for other things to make sense. So that's the first thing to get out of the way. And then when you're writing your scenes are supposed to be happening in a particular place in time, even if you're writing non-linearly. And so, given that, you want to be thinking about these anchor moments that you have in the book. Everybody has these very important uh, timeline moments, turning points, whatever you want to call them. An average memoir might have a 1 to 5 big events. Those kinds of events could qualify as things like someone dying, a child being born, an incident, a terrible incident like a rape or, another kind of trauma that someone might have experienced, a terrible accident where, something happened to you. Those are obviously major turning points because everything else revolves around that incident, right? The other things that might be less trauma, more celebratory, something like a wedding or a graduation. So these are major events that you're organizing in some ways your memoir around. I wouldn't say that time is an organizing principle, but big events that happen, and especially if they're defining moments for you, are moments that you can tether back to. And so, for instance, the reason I say this is especially if you're writing a nonlinear memoir, you could use that big defining moment and say, 2 years after I lost my dad, right? Or 6 months before my son was born. These kinds of things that the reader knows when these things happen. So you're not having to reiterate something to the effect of later in May 1983. That kind of stuff doesn't work as well, tracking dates, because dates are not as meaningful to your reader as they are to you. And we're all different ages along those date lines, right? So this is just a reiteration of the importance of tethering and paying attention as you're working in your scenes. And you might even get into the habit of writing into your scene itself a note to yourself about what the date was. If you want to put the month and the year, perfect. That doesn't mean it needs to be in the manuscript. It's just a note to yourself tracking when the scene happened. And then if you go on with your prose, because I'll see this happen sometimes, which is like a scene is written, it's in a particular place and time, and then the writer goes on to have reflective thoughts, and maybe pages will pass of reflection or something that is not anchored in scene. And then when we come back to a scene, I'm asking myself, where the heck are we in relation to the scene that I just read, like 4 or 5 pages ago? And so I want to be immediately re-anchored in that moment. And so that's your tracking over and over and over throughout your manuscript. And this may be something that you do in a revision process as well. but give yourself all of the little helpers that you can give yourself by way of putting your time markers into the manuscript. And remember this notion of what I'm talking about with regard to tethering, because the tethering is like stitching for the reader, kind of always hearkening back to earlier moments that we've read about. And they can be hearkening back to earlier moments that are turning points. So, like I said, the big events that the reader is going to remember, or they can be hearkening back to just little moments, the thing that we just read. So, mind that as you go, and it will be something like I know that some of you I've worked directly with, and so I like to joke that I'm obsessed with time. But the reason I'm obsessed with time and tracking time is because I always like to remind the writer, we have not lived your life. And I'm reading lots of memoirs that happened before I was even born. And so even more so important that I'm trying to figure out, like, how old is this person? What was happening? I'm not actually so interested in the year, although of course I am, because the years inform the story. You're of your generation, you're of your time, but I'm actually placing myself into your body at whatever age you are in a given scene, and I'm transposing my experience of being that age onto you. And so that's why this time marking and life event stuff is so important to track and get clarity on, so that your reader can really step into that experience. I'm just going to take Nina's question here because it says, would it be too much to start off a chapter with a few weeks later or something like that? That is excellent. Yes, I love it. And if you read certain memoirs, you'll see that that is a beautiful transition. It can open a new chapter, it can open a new scene. 2 weeks later, the following day, I woke up the next morning. So those kind of little time markers are wonderful, but they of course have to be tethered to something. Like if they're not tethered to, like, sometimes I'll see someone say the next morning, and I'm like, well, wait, the next morning from what? It's just hanging out there, not tethered to something. And so that's why we're going to call this craft chat tethering time. Tether your next transition, your time movement to a scene or to an event. And that way your reader will be tracking and following and knowing where we are. And again, it doesn't matter if this is linear or non-linear, all the more so actually if you're writing a non-linear, we need to know, and constantly be reiterated to where we are in your timeline.